All right, so we're going to be talking about the movement and cycling of matter today. So our question to start us off is, what do you think this is? And what I mean this, I'm referring to this very distinct line that goes all the way to the coast. So is it natural? Is it man-made? What do you think it is? And why do you think the coastal ocean that you see right here is so much lighter than the deep ocean out further? So what are the key concepts of today? That you can really detail the major pools and the flows of water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. You can understand how biological organisms might interact within those different types of cycles, and also how humans are influencing those cycles and their positive and or negative impacts. Really think about what problems might be solvable, are we doomed, and how are human activities really depleting these resources on top of how each cycle interacts with one another, sort of like how the different five main indicators interacted with one another. So when we talk about the water cycle, it's really important to know that most of the world's water is not usable for humans. Only a small sliver of it is available for drinking or agricultural water, and currently different types of water are under threat based on use. So in many places with increased temperature, we're seeing huge amounts of evaporation from the soil or transpiration from vegetation that would influence agriculture. Runoff from land use is really impacting other nutrient cycles and water quality health. Alternatively, places like Vermont are projected to get increased precipitation due to air temps and ocean evaporation, which also will impact humans. And finally, huge parts of the world are really depleting their groundwater reserves in terms of available water for human and agricultural use. Here are some good links about the California water wars, which happened about 100 years ago, and the future of California's water. And I only highlight that because California is so key to the United States in terms of water use and the implications for it. Now, so what are some of the impacts of humans on the hydrological cycle? As I mentioned earlier, most of the world's major aquifers or underground water reserves are being depleted at really extraneous rates in terms of being depleted. And that means that humans that exist there will likely not be able to exist in the future. Furthermore, water as the universal solvent is really good at transporting different dissolved nutrients, including nitrogen. Now what this means is as the Mississippi River exits into the Gulf of Mexico, contaminated nutrients from agriculture throughout the United States creates these anoxic zones because nitrogen is a really strong nutrient in terms of primary productivity. So these algal blooms grow in exponential rates, they die off, and as a result, oxygen is depleted. Now the carbon cycle, I'm sure you're familiar with from former classes, is really all about the cycling of carbon from the atmosphere and human impacts, but also what it means for oceanic life. Now, most of the world's carbon is stored within the lithosphere, the continental shelf crust of the world, and actually the ocean contains more dissolved carbon than the atmosphere, so we have more carbon dioxide in the oceans. Now, current human activities in terms of fossil fuel, land use, industry account for 100 times more flow of carbon into the atmosphere than does vegetation and animal respiration. So humans are really significantly impacting the flow of carbon into the atmospheric pool. Now, one possible solution that you can learn more about is how healthy soils from agriculture and from sustainable forestry can actually sequester a large amount of carbon. Now, obviously, the impact of human industry and activities has really led to a huge increase in atmospheric CO2. And we've also seen a huge increase in the dissolved amount of carbon dioxide in the oceans. This has led to a strong reduction in the alkaline nature of the ocean, so the ocean is becoming more acidic. We call this ocean acidification. And what this does is it really damages calcium carbonate-based organisms like coral or plankton or your shellfish that you would see on the ocean. So it has a huge impact on the biodiversity and ecosystems of the oceans. Furthermore, because of the increased air temperatures on the surface, huge parts of the United States are currently experiencing severe to moderate drought, which is spurring things such as the forest fires that we see in the West, but also the early foliage that we're seeing in Vermont this year. Now, our third cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Now, nitrogen is really key for all living things. If you remember back to your macromolecule unit in biology, nitrogen as an element is key for the backbone of both amino acids and nucleic acids. So we are built from nitrogen building materials that cycle through ecosystems. Now, a complex series of bacteria in soil with some association with plant roots results in the nitrogen gas leaving the atmosphere, becoming ammonia or ammonium, and then undergoing more changes to become nitrates, which is the usable form of nitrogen. And this will go assimilate into plants and animals, decompose, and the cycle will continue. Now, humans have found out how to fixate nitrogen gas into industrial fertilizer, which has had huge implications for the world's population and agriculture. But because we apply so much artificial fertilizer to croplands, we see that runoff often leads to aquatic ecosystems having algal blooms and anoxic zones, as I mentioned earlier. We often overuse it and overapply it, which doesn't help the leaching. So this is a cool graph I just wanted to show you. This is the world's current population. This would be the world's population that could be supported without synthetic fertilizer. So in the 1900s, humanity was really facing shortages in the ability to produce more and more food. And a famous chemist found out how to fixate nitrogen gas, which now allows almost half of the world's population to be fed by synthetic fertilizer means. This is the delta of the Mississippi River, and you can see all of this runoff entering the ocean, which is really based on sort of the corn and grain industry in the Midwest. This is the red zones show where the most nitrogen is being put down on fields, which a lot of it empties into the ocean, causing huge amounts of oxygen depletion. So we have the phosphorus cycle, and if you remember from cellular respiration, phosphorus, ATP, is really important for energy of cells and hence organisms. Now, most phosphorus cycles through food webs in terms of producers, consumers, and decomposers. However, unlike nitrogen, there's no readily available source of artificial phosphorus fertilizer. So it's really important that we use phosphorus sparingly, but it can also leach into waterways, which can cause additional algal blooms, just like nitrogen. And there's a really good article right here, Phosphate Running Out, that I'm going to mention in the next slide that you might take a glance at. So the image I showed you is in Morocco, and this is about 100-mile long conveyor belt that's bringing phosphates from mines in Morocco to the coast to be shipped globally. Now, phosphate is a limited nutrient, but it's also a depleted resource in terms of the sustainability of human use. We produce about 170 million tons of phosphate each year, but it's quickly running out due to overuse and overdemand. So things like India's population boom, Brazil's agricultural boom would have never happened without this, but we're running out and we don't know of any new sources. Now, locally, we have huge algal blooms in Lake Champlain, which is primarily driven by agricultural runoff and wastewater treatment sites that leach out excess phosphorus, causing these nasty, slimy, green, dangerous pools of water. So finally, we can talk about the sulfur cycle. Now, sulfur is important because it offers a gateway into thinking about how we can solve other issues. Sulfates are really key to the food cycle, and they can also enter into water systems via runoff. Now, humans' main impact on the sulfur cycle is combusting sedimentary rocks like coal for energy and heat, which releases sulfur dioxide. Those sulfur dioxides will enter into the hydrological cycle as what we call acid rain, and that acid rain has really detrimental effects on soil and plant life, some of which you can still see if you hike the main mountains of Vermont, where you'll see swaths of dead pine trees from acid rain in the 80s. Now, in 1990, the Clean Air Act had an amendment which really limited the amount of sulfur dioxide coming out of coal power plants. And what I want you to know is that while we might think of climate change or addressing environmental issues as a very partisan issue now, at the time, 400 out of 423 representatives and 90 out of 100 senators passed this amendment. So just based on that single evidence, obviously that was a long time ago, but there is evidence that people from both parties can work to have huge impacts on the environment if there are compromises, but also we use good science to create good policy. So I hope that was informative for all of the different cycles. These additional learnings are definitely interesting, and we'll be thinking about running out of phosphate soon. Thank you.